The Prime Ministers Who Never Were, a collection of counterfactuals. Good evening, Francis.
Good evening, Mehdi.
Tell our listeners, first and foremost, what is a counterfactual history?
It's just like a history book, only what it says didn't happen. It says, if things had gone very slightly differently, if the chips had fallen very slightly differently on this particular occasion, these are the consequences, this would have happened, these are the long-term consequences. And it's written as though it's actual history. So we don't say, if this had happened, this happened. We say, this happened, then this happened, and then this happened. Just as though we were writing real history.
Yes, I was just reading through it before. So you've got all these chapters about various people, various kind of mini-biographies of Norman Tebbit, Michael Foote, Dennis Healey, Neil Kinnock, Herbert Morrison, Oswald Mosley, Austin Chamberlain, variety of people throughout the last 100 years or so who could have been Prime Minister, came very close to becoming Prime Minister, didn't make it through the door, but here they're imagined they did and what that means.
That's right, and I was very strict about gatekeeping. I made sure that every single person who was allowed into the book would have been Prime Minister at there was a particular moment in history when, if the chips had fallen very slightly differently, they would have been Prime Minister.
So it's not just a bunch of leaders of the opposition. You've got people like Brad Butler and George Brown,
absolutely,
Labour and Tory,
on the other hand, we have not got, for example, Ian Duncan Smith. Because
he never had a hope in hell of being Prime Minister in any universe.
He was leader of the Tory party, of course, but there was never a moment where you or I or anybody else said, goodness me, Ian Duncan Smith might be Prime Minister.
I don't think Betsy Duncan Smith ever thought he was going to be Prime Minister, to be honest.
I'm not even sure he did.
No, which is a sad moment for the Tories. Interestingly here, what's the purpose of writing a book like this? Is it to examine, is it just a bit of fun, or is it to examine kind of lessons learned?
Well, it is fun. It's fun to write, and I hope it's fun to read. But it's also to examine lessons learned. It's also to look at that. There's no other way that's quite as good, in my view, as enabling you to learn the lessons of history.
And if we don't would have happened
if we don't learn the
Neil
lessons
Ferguson, the historian, well-known television, he's done a lot of counterfactual history, hasn't he?
Yes, he's done an enormous amount of counterfactual history, and he, I think, thinks, as I do, that it has a value, that you can look at what could have happened. If, for example, you look as we do in this book, at what would have happened had John Smith lived to become Prime Minister in 1997, as he certainly would have done had he lived, then you have a vision of a much, much better society, because in partly this is because under the British system, the Prime Minister is massively powerful, far more powerful, say, than the President is in the American system, or the President is in the French system, because, you can have an American President who does not have the support of Congress. You can't have a British Prime Minister who doesn't have, broadly speaking, the support of the House of Commons. So, and the, all the political support that the Prime Minister needs is in what you might call the payroll vote, in the sense that anybody in his party who wants promotion knows that his promotion is in the hands of the Prime Minister. So he's got an enormous amount of power. He can create the political temperature in a way that other democratic leaders can't.
Just coming back to the actual thesis of the book and the reason for writing it, you say in your introduction, individuals make history. There's no inevitability and everything's up for grabs. Marx was right about a lot of things, but he was wrong about that. Tell me why you think that is.
Well, I think Marx's idea of historicism is completely false. Marx's theory was that there were great forces of history which were
socio-economic,
in the end going to coalesce into so that the end result, you might fidget around at the edges, but the end result was always going to be the same. In fact, you've only got to look at the massive influence over the whole direction of history, the whole sweep of history that particular individuals have, to realise that has to be wrong. That can't. History can't work like that.
But individual men and women can change history.
The individual men and women can change history, and the ripples of what they do go out. So the further down the line you go from somebody who actually has changed history, the more those ripples become waves. What the Clement Attlee government did between 1945 and 1951 became a kind of tidal wave. By 1979. In 1979, it started to be turned back. You can look at it two ways. You can say that Clement Attlee turned us into a civilised society, and Margaret Thatcher came along and turned us back again, which is, I think, what I think how I would view it, or you can view it, I expect, in some other ways. But whichever way you view it, what you're saying is those two individuals created the political temperature. They created the world that people lived in for years afterwards, and it was not done by impersonal historical forces.
Okay, and on the subject of the kind of the people you've lined up, everyone, has this old parlour game as to who was the best Prime Minister who never was. Sure. You've got a variety of people in here. A couple of questions. Number one, Michael Heseltine, who's often cited, especially by Conservatives, as the great Prime Minister who never was, came very close when he stuck the knife into Thatcher, but didn't get the job. John Major got the job. Why didn't he make the cut?
In the sense, Michael Heseltine is almost the one I regret most. Michael Heseltine actually should have made the cut. The reason he didn't was that there was one moment in history when Michael Heseltine could have become Prime Minister. It was after the resignation of Margaret Thatcher, and we went for a Tebbit premiership at that moment. So that what we've got in the book is a very, very good chapter, very interesting chapter, written by a very bright young Conservative called Peter Cuthbertson, about what a Tebbit premiership would have looked like. And so we decided not to go for two counterfactual essays taking off from exactly the same year in history. But I have to say to you that that's a reasonable criticism of the book. Michael Heseltine, there's an extremely good argument for saying Heseltine ought to be in it.
Isn't that... Was Norman Tebbit really ever in the running to be
Norman Tebbit could very easily have been Prime Minister right at that time.
Did he have those ambitions himself?
Well, he did initially. What he says now is that he would have gone for it, he would have driven for it, had it not been for what had happened to his wife and the need for him to spend a lot of time with his wife, who was confined to a wheelchair after the
Brighton bombing also would not have had to have happened for this counterfactual.
Well, no, not necessarily. We're assuming the Brighton bombing did happen, but Norman Tebbit still ran. But if you think about the circumstances when Thatcher resigned, the circumstances that enabled John Major to get the job, which was basically that Thatcher personally phoned most of the Conservative Parliamentary Party and told them they had voted for John Major. Now, if Thatcher was capable of delivering it for the almost unknown John Major, then she could have delivered it for the very, very well-known Norman Tebbit, had Norman Tebbit been available.
And I suspect they would have crashed out in 1992. You've got a list.
They might well have done, although that's not the counterfactual essay we've written.
They're not linked to each other, I suppose. Let me just go through this list. Austen Chamberlain, J.R. Clines, Lord Halifax, Oswald Mosley, Herbert Morrison, Hugh Gaitskell, Rab Butler, George Brown, Norman Tebbit, Michael Foot, Dennis Healey, Neil Kinnock, John Smith, David Miliband. Of that list, who do you wish actually had walked through the door of number 10? Your personal preference?
I would like to have seen a lot of them walk through the door of number 10. I suppose the one that I want to go for first is the almost unknown J.R. Clines. Now, an awful lot of listeners to this programme will never have heard of Clines.
But they'll have heard of the man who wrote the chapter, Phil Woolas, the disgraced ex-Labour MP, has written the chapter on J.R. Clines.
They'll certainly have heard of Phil Woolas, who wrote the chapter. And Phil Woolas, has to be said, is Clines' greatest fan in all the world. Clines, the seat that Phil no longer sits for was also the seat that Clines sat for, with slightly different borders, obviously.
I suspect Clines didn't campaign in the same way as Phil Woolas.
Well, this isn't really the subject we're talking about, but I often think... I sometimes do think that if every member of Parliament who produced a leaflet like the ones Phil Woolas produced were drummed out of Parliament for doing so, we would be awfully short of legislators.
Fair enough. So on Clines, tell us about Clines.
Going back to Clines, he had the votes fallen very slightly differently in 1922 for the leadership of the Labour Party. Clines would have been leader rather than Ramsay MacDonald, who became the leader and, as you know, as we all know, formed the first Labour government and then the second Labour government, but neither of those governments with an overall parliamentary majority. Now, Phil's thesis in this chapter, and I must say I think there's something to be said for it, is that, firstly, Clines would not have panicked in the way that Ramsay MacDonald did at the time of the Zinoviev letter, which was the forged Soviet letter. And that he would have he would have pulled Labour together, and we would not have had to wait until 1945 for the first Labour government with an overall majority. But he goes much further than that, and he says that later on, Kleins would have been able, as Prime Minister, to abrogate the Versailles Treaty, and to cut a very long story short, there would have been no Second World War.
We'll come back to that's a very, very ambitious claim there. You're listening to Francis Beckett there, and you're also listening to LBC 97.3. The time now is 9:45. Time now for a travel update with Alan Joyce.
Thanks, Mehdi, and still big...
c.co.uk/podcasts.
You're listening to me, Mehdi Hasan, sitting in for Ian Dale. This is the LBC Book Club. I've got with me in the studio Francis Beckett, who's edited a new book called The Prime Ministers Who Never Were. It's a counterfactual history book, imagining if certain people, like George Brown, the Labour politician, or Norman Tebbit, the Tory politician, or David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary, had actually become Prime Minister, what would life have been like? How different would it have been? What was their influence? Francis, you were telling us about J.R. Kleins, and you were saying, had he become Labour leader in the 1920s instead of Ramsay MacDonald, we could have avoided World War II. Isn't that a little bit fantastical?
That's the thesis we've advanced in the book. Now, there's no way you can prove... There's no way... One of the joys of counterfactual history is there's no way you can prove anything. But if you read the chapter, Phil Wallace makes a magnificent case for saying exactly how it could have happened. It begins with Labour getting an overall majority, which, as you know, Labour never did in the interwar years. Labour didn't have an overall majority until the 1945 government. If you assume that Kleins was would have been a massively more competent leader than Ramsay MacDonald, which I think these days most people looking at the records of the two of them would say was the case. Ramsay MacDonald did not prove to be a particularly good leader, even before he eventually decided to throw in his lot with the Conservative Party. If you make that assumption, then Labour can do almost anything. Kleins certainly had an enormous internationalism. He certainly understood very, very early on that the seeds of another war lay in the Versailles Treaty. Whether he could have averted it, of course, it's a massively ambitious thesis. But all I can say is, read the book. Phil makes a very, very good case for it.
Well, in terms of ambitious theses and kind of things that might be deemed to be a little bit fanciful in counterfactual world, you also have a chapter on Oswald Mosley, who's elected as Labour leader in 1935 instead of Clement Attlee. He becomes Winston Churchill's deputy throughout the war and then Prime Minister in 1945. He goes on to win the 1950 election before resigning in 1955 after failing to persuade people to switch to the alternative vote.
Yes,
and
again,
there's a story.
Now that's a chapter written by Nigel Jones, who's quite a considerable biographer. Is the best known, I think, as the biographer of Rupert Brooke, which is quite a long way from this. But he has also written a biography of Oswald Mosley, and he makes, once again, all I can say is that it sounds fanciful, but read the chapter. He makes a very good case for it. Now, if you look back at Mosley's career, you can see at least how the beginning of it works. He was one of the rising stars of the 1929 to 31 Ramsay MacDonald government. He was a massive figure in that. Now, if you assume that when the election for Labour leader came up in 1935, it was really between Clement Attlee and Herbert Morrison, and at the time it looked fairly even between the two. Now, had Mosley decided to remain within the Labour Party, he would certainly have been up there in the running for the Labour leadership. In the 29 to 31 government, he was certainly a more publicly recognisable figure, a better known figure, a more charismatic figure, certainly than Clement Attlee, probably than Herbert Morrison as well. He would certainly have been in the running for the leadership in 1935. Had he won the leadership in 1935, heaven knows.
And we talked, apart from Oswald Mosley, probably the other name that jumps out to me when I look at the contents page of the various people who could have made it into number 10, Michael Foot. Michael Foot, was he really anywhere close to Downing Street? I mean,
yes.
He led Labour to its worst result since 1918.
Yes, he was, not because of the 1983 election, because when he went into the 1983 election, everybody knew he was going to lose by a landslide, and he did, in fact, lose by a landslide. He didn't come anywhere close to Downing Street as Labour leader. The reason he's in the book is that in 1976, when Harold Wilson resigned, he was the main candidate against Jim Callaghan. And he came within very, very few votes of defeating Callaghan. In fact, people forget now, on the first ballot, when it was Foote against Callaghan, Foote was leading.
There were four candidates, weren't there?
Callaghan, and Callaghan only won on second preferences. In other words, Callaghan won the leadership because of the alternative vote.
Who does that remind me of? Which Labour leader does that remind me of?
If we'd had a first-past-the-post system, we would have had Michael Foot as Labour leader in 1976.
And therefore Prime Minister, because Labour commanded a majority of the cards.
Because Labour at that time was in government.
So that's the scenario under which Michael Foot,
so
under
that's
your
the scenario,
not 1983
not
defeating
1983 at all. 1983, if his claim rested on 1983, he wouldn't have a claim, and he wouldn't be in it.
And Francis, you wrote your chapter, you edited the whole book, but you've written one chapter, interesting, probably the one of the list, the person I'd probably most like to see, perhaps because it's more relevant to my own lifetime, John Smith. Had he not died in 1994, he clearly would have defeated John Major. I don't think anyone disagrees with that, not even Norma Major. He probably wouldn't have got a majority of 170 odd, probably got a smaller majority than Blair, but a working majority. Tell me a little about what John Smith premiership would have looked like.
Well, John Smith, I particularly wanted to write the John Smith chapter myself because I just wanted to see what an alternative Labour government to the appallingly shallow and meretricious Labour government that we had under Tony Blair might have looked.
Don't hold back there, Francis.
And well, maybe I shouldn't hold back. Maybe I should tell you what I really think about it. But I think an enormous number of things would have been very different. There would have been something very different right at the beginning, that I suspect that he would immediately have had a look at this proposed vast round shed that the government was proposing to build in Greenwich and say, well, what plans have we got for using this shed? And having discovered that there were no plans, he would have cancelled the wretched thing. More fundamentally and in the longer term, I'm fairly sure there would have been no war in Iraq. I'm fairly sure that we would not have been engaged in that war because it was very much a personal adventure of Tony Blair's, and most Labour leaders of that time weren't. I mean, Robin Cook was against it. Gordon Brown is said to have been against it in his heart. Sadly, he didn't stand up at the time and say so. John Smith, I think, would certainly have been against it, and had he been the Prime Minister, we would not have fought that war.
And would he have won the 2001-2005 elections? Would he have stuck around that long, do you think?
Well, he wouldn't have stuck around that long because, in the end, I mean, he did have a suspect heart. He'd had a heart attack, as you know, some years before the one that actually killed him. So our thesis, the thesis that I've advanced in this book, is that he does hang around for the 2001 election. He does win it, but he resigns fairly shortly after that, having so arranged things that everybody thinks he is ensuring that Gordon Brown is going to take over. But in fact, John Smith rather typically plays his cards very, very close to his chest, and so arranges things that Ken Livingstone becomes Prime Minister and delivers 10 years of municipal socialism.
Well, there's, I think the word fanciful comes back to mind again. Tony Blair doesn't appear in your scenario at all.
Yes, he does. He gets kind of completely carved up, and in the, I really enjoyed.
You really must have enjoyed writing this chapter.
I really had a good time.
You're a big fan of Tony Blair. Somebody's just texted in saying Don has said John Smith was the best Prime Minister we never had.
I'd go along with
that. David from Sevenoaks says Dennis Healey was the best PM we ever had. Both Labour supporters. I don't know if there's any Tories out there who want to text in 84850 to tell us who was the best Tory PM we never had. Francis, there are no women in the book.
There aren't.
Women made the list.
I knew men. I knew that a lot of people would sort of look at it rather strangely and say,
Barbara Castle, Shirley Williams.
And the reason there are no women is that, those are the two who, and I looked at the careers of both of them because I wanted to get at least one woman into the book. But you had to find a moment, there had to be a moment when, if the chips had fallen very slightly differently, the person would have been Prime Minister. I looked for that moment in the case of Barbara Castle and in the case of Shirley Williams. I couldn't find that one moment. So, sadly, I had to write a book, I had to edit a book where there were no women.
And very quickly, the last chapter is on David Miliband. How would he have become Prime Minister under your counterfactual
Well, David
scenarios?
Miliband would have become Prime Minister.
Very briefly, go on, tell us in 1 second.
As everybody knows, because he should have stood against Gordon Brown for the Labour leadership, become Prime Minister, and of course reignited the Blair-Brown wars with a vengeance.
And one last question, very brief. Do you think Ed Miliband's ever going to appear in a book like this?
I hope not.
I hope he'll make it through number 10.
Like you, I suspect. I think he'll be Prime Minister.
Okay, thank you very much. That's Francis Beckett, who's edited a new book called The Prime Ministers Who Never Were. Thank you very much for you all listening in to the LBC Book Club. Coming up after 10 is James Max in for Clive Bull. This is LBC 97.3.
Out here, everyone's worrying